webinar as a part of a series of One Health held by AFLAO to update the important topics for every country. This will be streamed in English and Spanish. We will have simultaneous interpretation into both languages. Please share and comment this event with the hashtag Una Sola Salud and hashtag Una Sola Salud. First, we will have the the opening remarks from the Andrés González, who will offer a brief introduction of the meeting of this webinar. Thank you, Nicolas, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor. Welcome, all of you. Avian influence in Latin America and Caribbean, lessons learned, challenges, and forecast for risk management in the region. So thank you for your commitment. This is such an important topic for the region and the world. Avian influence is still growing in the Americas, affecting trade, threatening humans and wildlife. This is not just agriculture. It's a challenge for collective preparedness for transboundary zoosanitary emergencies. We have over 47,000 outbreaks of avian flu affecting poultry, marine mammals, and pets. Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, and Peru, Puerto Rico have reported new outbreaks. Also, infections in human beings in Mexico, Chile, and Ecuador. The virus follows the natural paths of migratory birds over the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic, and Central America, linking ecosystems from Canada all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. At FAO, we're tracking a crisis we believe of great expansion, fast expansion. The HPAI has been reported in over 35 countries and territories globally, has also spread to nearly 60 terrestrial mammals and marine mammals, including goats, cattle, and some pets. Human cases are also growing, emphasizing the role of the virus over and above poultry. In the U.S., the scale is even more amazing. Nearly 100 million poultry individuals have been affected. As of April, H5N1 has been reported in 17 states with 70 cases in humans. Individuals exposed to infected animals has gone through barriers among species, going from birds to foxes, seals, dairy, cattle. Well, the implications of the spread are really deep. The outbreak of infections in dairy cattle has proven the impact of this virus can have in value chains above agriculture. Detection of these H5N1 in cattle, it's an important development leading to a renewed care to biosafety, the veterinary capabilities, and resilience of food production systems in the Americas. This is a food crisis, it's a health crisis, ecological crisis, which grows fast over and above isolated responses. We support small, medium producers and providing animal protein to millions of families. But these backyard small producers are unprotected without support. The systems may become entry points for even more dangerous outbreaks. National strategies are essential, yet not enough. The virus going through the migratory paths across continents requires a vast response. Fragmented country-by-country efforts take the risk of being late and poor containment with the cascading effects on agriculture, trade, and public health. What we need now is international coordination with a good leadership and sustained investment in animal health system. At FAO, we know how to do it. Investments in biosafety, surveillance, early warning, and local veterinary capabilities have proven effective in those countries that have adopted. Between 2023 and 2024, FAO teams worked in over 50 countries and helped controlling over 440 outbreaks, including avian flu, in close coordination with national authorities. It is necessary to set a sound and actionable public-private association allowing for reacting to the crisis before it goes uncontrollable. In Latin America and the Caribbean, FAO has emergency programs in 11 countries, from Argentina to Honduras, to deploy early detection tools and reinforce first front-line response. In the U.S., our efforts to strengthen biosafety diagnostic tests in the farms have started to stabilize egg prices. These efforts are going in the right direction, but once again, they need to be connected. For over 20 years, FAO has supported countries in facing avian flu, and this work is not just global solidarity, but it's direct investment in protection of food systems, economies, and public health. No countries can stop avian flu on its own, but we can have more resilient agri-food systems and more resilient to these type of transboundary diseases. Thank you once again for joining this webinar. I hope this will be a platform to share knowledge, experience, and strategies will allow us to face this challenge together. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Andres, for this presentation and for emphasizing the importance of this disease for the whole region. This event has 4 speakers and a Q&A period, so you can write your questions in the chat of this webinar. First of all, we have Nick Lyons, who is an epidemiologist and veterinarian from the UK, joined the FAO in 2023 and led the global surveillance of this disease and supported countries in multiple regions in the best implementations of tools and strategies for the disease. And Nick Lyons is not here with us, but he sent a video which we'll be sharing with you.
And also from recommendations at WOA General Sessions and the Avian Influenza Animal Health Forum. So the process took almost 2.5 years and involved international, or indeed was led by international experts. And one of the experts involved is David Swain, who's presenting today. There are 3 key pillars to this strategy. These are prevent, protect, and transform. So prevent in terms of HPI epidemics, panzootics, and negative impacts on biodiversity through multi-sectoral early detection and control. Protect the poultry value chains, livelihoods, trade, and the health of humans, ecosystems, and other animals from avian influenza impacts. And transform those value chains, poultry value chains, to improve their resilience to avian influenza and other disease threats. So in the strategy, I'll provide the link at the end of the presentation, but there is a detailed theory of change which goes into all of these in more detail. But I just want to give you a bit of a flavor for what the meat on the bones of what we really mean by these different terms. So prevent is focused on strengthening systems and capacities for risk assessment, timely detection and response to inform early warning and risk management. So on the slide here, these are the anticipated outputs that we expect from these different pillars of the strategy. So the outputs under prevent would include improved risk monitoring and risk-based surveillance, enhanced diagnostic capacities for early detection and differentiation, and multi-sectoral preparedness and response. Under the protect pillar, this emphasizes the actions to protect poultry from HPI infection through biosecurity, vaccination, zoning, and compartmentalization. And the outputs we expect are reduced HPI risks along the value chain, the poultry value chain, HPI vaccine stewardship guidance, and development of infection-free value chains and safe trade. Under the transform pillar, well, this reflects a broader vision to ensure sustainable poultry production that's resilient to disease and climate change threats and meets future market demands and also addresses aspects of animal welfare. The outputs we expect are to build safe and resilient poultry value chains, to have enhanced knowledge sharing on risk management, sustainable and effective public and private veterinary services, to provide an evidence base for policy change. So the assumptions highlight that, so there are various assumptions, as with any sort of theory of change, and these highlight that without HPI being a priority disease, without using the One Health approach and having effective public-private partnerships, that this would jeopardize successful implementation of the strategy at the country level. So we assume that these things are, these all kind of go along with the implementation of the strategy. So it's important to emphasize the importance of those assumptions. So here the slide just has what the anticipated implementation steps for implementing the strategy, and we've undertaken steps 1 and 2 in terms of launching it and publishing it. Now it's down to that regional engagement piece and developing national HPI plans based or revising them based on this strategy. So, of course, there will be reviews along the way and yearly monitoring around implementation. Other aspects that will be sort of going alongside the implementation would be to identify technical and capacity gaps and to advocate for support and seize those funding opportunities when they come along. So what next for the Latin America and Caribbean region? Well, what we expect is that there would be the development of coordinated action plans for the region using this new global strategy as a guide. There would be a process by assessing regional needs and addressing the capacities that have been identified. Steering committees and standing group of experts as part of that. But we also hope that the region is able to identify and seize those opportunities for funding and resource mobilization to support the implementation of the strategy as they come along. So in conclusion, the GFTAD's global strategy, and you'll see the link on the page here, the QR code will take you direct to the full version of the new strategy. But the hope is that this strategy, through providing that comprehensive approach to managing HPI risks and emphasizing the importance of One Health, the One Health approach and effective public-private partnerships, we hope that this strategy is able to bring together all the relevant stakeholders to collaborate and support the implementation and ultimately protect our poultry value chains and assure a resilient future. So at the moment, the strategy is only available in English, but we do hope in time we can get this translated into Spanish and other languages. As well as highlighting this strategy, I would also like to take this opportunity to raise awareness that FAO are planning to have a global science policy dialogue on HPI in September 2025, which we are organizing with colleagues from the Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. So please watch this space on when that will be communicated further, and I hope to see many of you there. Sorry that I'm not able to present this live, but please feel free to ask questions, and if the panel cannot address these today, the organizer send them to me, and I'll be very happy to respond directly to any questions or queries that arise. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening, and I hope the rest of the session goes well. Thanks.
Muchas gracias por la presentación, doctor Nick Lyons. Nos disculpamos por el inconveniente técnico. La presentación empezó un poquito avanzada. A modo de resumen general, la presentación del doctor Lyons intentaba hacerles
the presentation by Dr. Lyons intended to present the global framework and how the regional strategy emerges from that global framework in terms of transport disease controls in this collaborative work, which is called One Health, which is summarized in that guideline that has been recently made available to all participants, and thus invite you all to the event that will take place in September. All the presentations today that will be delivered today can be subsequently downloaded, and likewise the recording of this webinar. Now we have a presentation by Dr. David Swine about the present situation of this disease in the Americas. For 38 years, he has worked in research and control of avian influenza, and he has been a leader of the global network of experts on avian influenza, participating actively in the World Animal Health Organization and also with the FAO. For 28 years, he has acted as director of the research laboratory on birds in the US, in Georgia, and over the past 7 years has been a professor at the University of Ohio and is presently a private consultant in avian influenza and control strategies. Dr. Swain, you have the floor, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the organizers and the invitation to come and speak with you today. I hope that I can give you some information that's helpful in understanding what is going on globally, as well as within the Americas with HiPath AI. Next slide. So this is a series of graphs and line diagrams that kind of indicate where we're at since 2005, when WOA started really tracking HiPath AI up until last Friday. Most of the outbreaks of HiPath AI that have been reported have been what we call the goose Guangdong related lineage of HiPath H5 with various types of reassortment neuraminidase subtypes. And when you look at the bar graph at the top, you can see we have these multiple peaks which correspond to transcontinental movements of this goose Guangdong H5 virus. And in the red box is the current outbreak that we're undergoing, which began in 2020 and goes up through at least the end of 2024. In each of these transcontinental movements, it involved a different clade of virus, and that's the hemagglutinin clade of this goose Guangdong lineage. Today, the current one is the 2344B that we are facing across 6 different continents. Globally, we've had over 48,000 outbreak events, over 48 million deaths in domestic as well as wild birds, and over 655 million domestic birds, that's backyard as well as commercial poultry, that have been culled and disposed of. Next slide. So kind of a summary of what's been going on globally in wild birds, and the way it's reported to the World Organization for Animal Health is wild birds and backyard poultry are reported together because they do not impact trade. And so if you can see from the 5 years of bar graphs, this is the reporting of the number of outbreaks. We had 2 really different peaks of wild bird outbreaks across the world. And these correspond to peaks in death of animals. The first one was in January to June of 2022. This is when we had massive numbers of infections of wild birds in North America, but also corresponding infections of European wild birds with die-offs. This was followed in the next year, the same timeline, in January to June of 2023, with the second peak. And this was involving wild bird infections in South America as the virus spread from North America into South America. But also there were ongoing outbreaks in Northern Europe involving seabirds like gannets, etc. And then finally, if you look at 2024 and 2025, you'll see there has been a decline in the number of outbreaks, but also a decline in the mortalities reported in wild birds, as well as the reduction in culling of backyard poultry. Next. Now, when we talk about poultry, we're talking about commercial poultry, and globally, we had a huge peak in 2022. This peak really corresponded to outbreaks and high numbers of culling, as you can see in the yellow line below it. And then this was followed as declines up until the late part of 2024. Then in the late 2024 and into 2025, we saw actually an increase in outbreaks and in culling, as you can see from that yellow line, as we had a resurgence of the virus in wild birds and spreading into domestic poultry. And for us in the United States, it was mainly a large number of infections in large layer farms. If you go and look at the World Organization for Animal Health website, you can see where it changes the reporting and gives you a table that looks at migration year instead of calendar year. And when you look at that, it makes more sense of the wild bird population and the transmission of that virus from wild birds to domestic poultry. And you can see that just since October in the last 6 months, we've actually had more countries reporting outbreaks than were in the previous migration year. And the total number of high-path outbreaks in poultry was also more than the previous migration year, as well as the number of wild bird cases. So this outbreak of high-path AI is not over. It's in certain regions of the world in hotspots. Next slide. But let's not forget there are other types of high-path AI that we have to deal with. So for example, we have two different strains that are entrenched in a couple of regions. One is the H7N3 high-path AI virus that is entrenched in Mexico and also parts of Guatemala that is ongoing, as well as since 2017, the H7N9 high-path virus in China. In both of these situations, vaccination is practiced widely as a management tool, and since the practice of that vaccination, there have been few outbreaks reported. Next slide. This is followed on by other H7s that are emerging viruses. And these are viruses where a low-path H7 mutated to a high-path virus was quickly detected and action was taken. The largest of these is one in South Africa that began in 2023 and has gone up into 2024 of an H7N6 involving 116 premises, over 9.6 million birds, mainly layers and broilers, and then one case was spent fowl moving into Mozambique. The second outbreak was much smaller. This was in Germany in June of last year, involving H7N5 high-path on only one premise of outdoor reared layers, 90,000 birds. It has been declared free. Australia, since May of 2024 up through February, has had 4 different outbreaks involving between 1 and 7 premises by different strains of H7 virus. 3 of those have been completely eradicated, and the fourth one is in the final stages of eradication with surveillance to support that eradication. New Zealand had an outbreak of H7N6 in December of this past year on a single premise of outdoor reared layers. And then most recently in the United States and Mississippi, we had an outbreak of H7N9 in broiler breeders, which has been depopulated and undergoing the last piece of surveillance. In all of these situations with emergent viruses, the standard is a stamping out with no vaccination, and all of these will eventually become free from high-path AI by declaration by their host country. Next slide. So we'll shift to the Americas and kind of give you a summary of what's happened in wild birds and backyard poultry. This is from 22 through 25, or May 25. And I think you can see there is a peak in 2023 involving wild birds and backyard poultry outbreaks, as well as the deaths of those birds, as in the blue line down below, the yellow line being the number of birds culled. And this is the result of the virus spreading across both North and South America, and that gave us those high numbers. involving in wild birds. And of course, the domesticated poultry, the backyard poultry, those are very good sentinels to indicate what it is like in the wild bird arena because they are getting direct exposure and transmission from wild birds to the backyard poultry. We saw a decline in late 2023 in the Americas in both wild bird and backyard flock deaths, as well as the culling of backyard flocks. And that continued on until this point in 2024, beginning in the fall, where we saw increased numbers in the fall of wild bird cases and as well as backyard birds, and the deaths that corresponded with that. We see that there has been throughout the Americas, the original H5N1 that was introduced in 2021 into Canada and has spread throughout Canada, the US, Mexico, down into Central and South America, that this virus H5N1 has undergone reassortment, exchanging genes of the high path virus with genes from our wild bird low path viruses to produce different kinds of reassortant high path viruses. All, of course, are H5, but having other genes in the internal segments. So, for example, we talk about different genotypes and how they have spread, but the genotype B3.2 identified in Canada and the United States is the one that spread throughout Latin America and has caused most of the cases that have been reported in those regions. But also in the United States, another genotype, the B3.13, is the genotype that has infected dairy cattle. And then we have most recently in the fall of 2024, the main wild bird viruses have been this D1.1 genotype and also has infected dairy cows with D1.1. Next slide. When we look at poultry, we can see the same kind of decline with a peak in 2022, and that was the peak when North America had most of its poultry cases. But there were still cases going on in 2023 as the virus spread into South America. In late 2022, there was a decline in the number of culling as well as it continued in that 2023 timeline. But then we started seeing a seasonal outbreak in poultry. That is, seasonal when wild birds that were infected were moving through. These are aquatic birds, waterfowl, and chondriformes, and they would transmit the virus to domesticated poultry. In 2024, we saw a slight increase in the number of outbreaks. But what we really saw was a big increase in the number of culling of birds, and that again is primarily the result of the United States having infections in large layer flocks, which have up to 5 million birds in them. And we saw this continuation into early spring, but now we have a major decline in the number of poultry cases reported in the Americas at this current time. Next slide. In Canada, fall of 2024, there was an increase in infected flocks, mostly in British Columbia, involving turkeys, again transmitted from wild migratory waterfowl, with the current status of 17 active outbreaks that are undergoing decontamination. Since the initial outbreaks in St. John's, Newfoundland in November 21, there have been 518 commercial and backyard premises affected with over 14 million poultry culled. They've also identified since 2021 over 2,858 wild bird cases. However, it's interesting if you look at the lower graph that's in orange, there were no cases in the summer in Canada. And you can see clearly in 24 and in 2025, we have undergone the seasonal pattern where we have fall and early winter with the bulk of the wild bird cases. Next. In the U.S., when you look since the original outbreaks began in poultry in 2022 up through at least April, we've had over 12,000 wild birds identified infected in all 50 states, as well as District of Columbia, and a variety of species, but mainly waterfowl and shore seabirds, but some predatory and scavenger birds and peridomestic birds. This declined through the summer last year and then rose again in the fall, again at that seasonal movement of the virus as migratory birds move. We've also had infections in wild and feral mammals, as similar to what has been seen in Europe. We have reported 611 cases in mammals in 39 states, and these are all passive surveillance. So the animal is usually found by a person and reported to a veterinary diagnostic lab. The number one species has been feral domestic cats, followed by red foxes and other species of animals. In poultry, we've had over 1,693 premises affected. That's 782 commercial and 911 backyard flocks, with 169 million birds that have been depopulated. These cases are across all 50 states, that is because of the backyard poultry, as well as in the territory of Puerto Rico. However, in the last 30 days, so a good sign, we've only had 16 premises affected, 3 commercial and 13 backyard flocks with only 1 million birds affected in 8 different states. Next slide. When you look at a graph by month, you can see clearly the seasonal outbreak of the poultry cases because of the migratory waterfowl that move from their summer breeding grounds southward for the winter, and that's when the exposure occurs. There is one change that has happened, and that was in the summer of last year, in 2024, where we saw, beginning in April, cases in commercial poultry from the transmission from the dairy cow infections of the B3.13 into poultry operations, but that declined at the end of the summer. Then in the fall, we saw increases in poultry cases in the United States, either from primary introduction from wild bird reservoir, that's the D1.1 and D1.2 genotypes. There was some primary introduction, again, from the dairy cow reservoir, and there was some poultry farm to farm, but the majority have been introduction from the wild bird reservoir. And we've had a massive decline this spring, as you can see, with just 12 cases in March and only 3 up to now in April. Next slide. The unique thing that we've had in the United States is dairy cattle infections involving 1,048 herds as of last Friday. This is across 17 different states. In the last 30 days, there's only been 48 herds in 3 states affected, with Idaho being the primary one currently having affected dairy herds, California being second, Arizona being third. We have several states through their bulk milk surveillance testing program have shown that the dairy cattle within their state are free from infection. There's also been human infections in the U.S., 70 confirmed cases. These 38 have been in California, 11 Washington, and 10 in Colorado. Those are part of the dairy cow exposure, which there's 41 total cases from dairy cattle exposure. We've had in poultry culling crews 24 exposures, and then 5 others that have no known cause of exposure. In general, it's felt that early in the outbreaks, they were underreporting in dairy cattle cases because the surveillance programs were not in place to find it, as well as within humans because the testing is voluntary. To my knowledge, there's been no virologic or serological evidence of high path AI cattle infections outside the U.S. That includes what I've understood to be in Canada, Mexico, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands. There is, however, some evidence of serological infections in multiple dairy cattle was beef breeds in U.S. states, but these infections were only antibody detections. There was no clinical disease, and the majority of them were H1N1 human influenza exposure, which is, if this was examined across the rest of the world, I suspect you'd find a similar infection, a low-level antibody infection rate in cattle in other countries. In the UK in 1990s, they did some surveillance in dairy cattle there, and they did find a similar situation of a pretty high rate of H1N1 antibodies in dairy cattle across the British Isles. Next. In the U.S., it all began with detection first of death in peridomestic birds around dairy farms, and then finding of multiple feral cats that had died within that dairy farm. And it's known that these cats are fed milk at the end of the milking cycle, so they're most likely to receive contaminated milk. The milk has a very high concentration of the virus, and in the cattle, it produces an inflammation or a mastitis, and the virus is present in the milk secretory cells of the udder. There's a little bit of virus in the respiratory tract, but it's primarily in the mammary gland and none in the feces. This was a single introduction in the fall of the B3.13 genotype from wild birds into dairy cattle. It's unclear whether it came from a commercial farm or a small mixed farm. This is based on molecular analysis. There has been evidence of seropositive calves that had been fed contaminated milk in the field without any clinical disease, and experimentally it's been reproduced by aerosolizing exposure in calves. You get seroconversion with no disease. If you feed contaminated milk in experimental settings, you can get infection without any disease in calves. And also it's been shown in lactating dairy cows that get aerosol exposure, they can become infected. And most recently, there has been evidence of transmission via the milking machine. In February this year, there was a new genotype identified in Nevada. This is the D1.1, introduced from the wild bird reservoir into dairy cattle, and is also seen in Arizona. It's really well known from multiple experimental studies as well as in some commercial operational studies that pasteurization and cooking is very effective in inactivating the high path AI virus in milk and in meat, but also the same thing is true in eggs, as has been demonstrated previously. Next. There have been other examples of the virus being detected in mammal species, and these are usually sporadic infections that are dead-end infections. In goats in Minnesota, in February of 2024, an outbreak of high path AI in backyard poultry. There were goats within that small farm that became infected. The nanny goats, the kids that they produced, the offspring became infected and had virus within the brain, although the adults never were infected and had no virus in their milk. But it was a different genotype than was infecting our dairy cattle, a B3.6, and it was identical to what was in the chickens. So the chickens were infected chickens of the backyard flock were the exposure. Had a similar infection in alpacas in Idaho in May in a small mixed farm. This virus actually came from dairy cattle. And it's a B3.13, and it was present in the aborted fetuses from those alpacas. In October, in another small farm, this one in Oregon, there was a diagnosis of high path AI in backyard poultry. And also there were 5 pigs on this farm, and these pigs were tested. One of them was positive for very low levels of the virus. It was a D1.2, which was the virus spread by a migratory waterfowl. Most recently, in April of just last month, sheep in the United Kingdom reported to be infected by the high path H5N1. In this case, they were serologically positive, and there was on that small farm, again, infected ducks, domestic ducks in that farm, and they're most likely the source of the virus to the sheep. And there was the virus in the milk of the sheep, as has been reported before for dairy cattle. The other animals where we've had quite a few infections, again, is cats. Usually they are sporadically infected, either from eating infected wild birds, eating infected poultry meat, or consuming infected cow's milk. Next. My last slide is, of course, South America, and I'll have to say in general, in South America, there has been a decline in wild bird, domestic bird, backyard flocks, and poultry cases in South America since 2023. So the peak in South America for all those categories was in early 2023. That's the January to July timeframe, and since that time, the number of cases have declined. There are, unfortunately, ongoing wild bird cases and mammal cases in Antarctica and Antarctic polar front islands, the Malvinas, South Georgia Islands, Marion Island, etc. And these numbers, because the populations of birds in those areas are naive to this virus, are still quite high with high mortality. And this also continues with some sea mammals, such as elephant seals and sea lions. Next slide. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Swain, por la presentación.
Thank you, Dr. Swain, for your extremely
thorough and
comprehensive
updated presentation. Dr. Swain, the first message, I would say, it's the importance of data. Clearly, without data, these thorough analysis of the situation would be impossible, both for birds and the other species. Second big message shows the variability and epidemiology of the virus going from species to species, which reinforces the need to work with this One Health integrated approach and in anticipating as countries to have these preparedness in case of outbreaks. So far, the global environment and epidemiology situation. Let's do the next presentation. Remember, you can offer your comment in the Una Sola Salud hashtag and the Influenza Avian hashtag. Remember to ask your questions, telling us who you're asking the question to, using the chat pod. And remember that there will be a certificate that you will be able to download upon completing this event. Next, we'll have the third presentation by Dr. Hernan Rojas on lessons learned to date in our region, response to avian flu. He's a specialist in design and of animal health programs. He's a veterinarian with a PhD in epidemiology and economics in the Riddle University. He has been the head of the veterinary service in Chile at MinSal, led the emergency of avian flu in 2002. He was a national director of India and is an international consultant for multiple programs of FAO and a director of CESVA BCA here in Chile. So, Hernan, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining.
Muchas gracias. ¿Me escuchan?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Perfecto.
Loud and clear.
Bien, pues, bueno, muchas gracias por la,
Okay, thank
la
you.
presentación, Nicolás.
Thank you for the
Saludos a
kind
todos
introduction.
los que están
Greetings to
escuchando.
all those who are listening to us
Después de
today.
la presentación
After
de
the
Dr.
thorough
Swine,
presentation by
yo
Dr.
quiero
Swine,
hacer una presentación
I
muy
have
rápida
a
de
hands-on
esta
presentation
emergencia
on
sanitaria en
these
las Américas,
health
especialmente
emergency in the
el periodo
Americas, especially
2022-2024,
between
y las
2022-2024,
lecciones
and the
aprendidas
lessons
que hemos ido
learned
recogiendo en la interacción con los distintos
in
países,
interacting with the
particularmente en el
multiple
proyecto
countries,
de
particularly in
apoyo
a
que
support
hemos hecho a
project
través de
we
FAO.
had through
Para
FAO.
poder hacer estas
Being able to
levantamientos, lecciones aprendidas, es
conduct
tremendamente
this
importante
survey, it's
para
very
poder
important
recoger toda la
in order to
experiencia
collect
y
all the
aplicarla
experience
hoy día
and
en las
apply
condiciones
it
en riesgo,
today,
en
which is
situaciones
still
futuras, y no solamente para la
the
influenza aviar,
situation in
sino
the future
también para
problems, not
otras
only for avian
enfermedades
flu, but also for other
transfronterizas de alto impacto.
transboundary
Para poder hacer
diseases.
este trabajo, nosotros nos
To do
basamos
this,
en los
we
documentos que existen
use
en la
the
página web de la
guidelines
Agencia
on
de
the
Emergencias de FAO, que
Guide
muchos
to Preparing the
conocen,
Animal Health
y la Alianza
Emergencies and
Internacional de
FAO.
Trabajarla,
You were probably
donde deja explícito que
familiar
en los
with it.
tiempos de
It
paz
explains
los
that
países
in
tienen que
peace times,
prepararse para una
countries have to be
posible
ready for potential
emergencia. Esa preparación
emergencies.
debiese
That
intensificarse
preparedness
en
that
los
should
periodos de alerta
be
y
intensified during the
evitar
alert periods
toda
and then
gestión
roll
desde
out
la
all
emergencia
the
permanente y
management during the
posteriormente hacia la
emergency
reconstrucción.
itself and then lessons learned.
Si lo ponemos en simple,
If,
podríamos decir que los países
in a
debiesen estar
nutshell,
preparados
countries should
antes de
be
las
prepared
emergencias
before
para que puedan, en resumen,
emergencies
responder de la
and then
forma más rápida y
respond in
efectiva
the
posible
quickest
para
and
contener,
most effective
por una
manner to
parte, la infección
contain
y
the
por otra
infection on
parte,
the one
mitigar el
hand
impacto.
and to minimize
Eso es
impacts on
compatible,
the
pero
other.
eso es lo
That's
lo que
not
hicimos.
always compatible, but this is the
La
ultimate
verdad que
goal.
haciendo todo el análisis
In
de lo que ocurrió en
actuality,
estos
in
2
analyzing
años en los
these
distintos países,
2 years,
puede moverse a
there was a
veces hacia un lado o hacia
balance
otro entre una buena preparación o
between
mala
good
preparación y la
preparedness or
capacidad
bad
que pueden
preparedness
tener las
and the
naciones de responder
ability
a pesar de
the
cómo hayan
services
estado
had in
preparados.
order to react
Nosotros seleccionamos
despite this preparedness.
9
We've selected 9
lecciones aprendidas. Son
lessons
muchas más,
learned,
pero quisimos
many
marcar
more,
estas
but
son
we
quizás
wanted
las
to
más importantes.
emphasize these as
Algunas
the
pueden
most
parecer más
important ones.
obvias,
Some
otras no,
may sound
pero hemos
more
recogido
obvious,
algunas más de un
but
país, otras más de otro,
some are
pero
from
siempre hay que tener en cuenta
different
que esta es una
countries. But
región
bearing in mind that
globalmente
this is an extremely
diferente. Los países son muy
different
diferentes de acuerdo a su
region.
población
Countries are
animal,
different from
condiciones
the animal
climáticas,
population, human
servicios
population,
veterinarios,
veterinary services
ambiente natural,
quality,
ecología,
natural
y otros
environment,
elementos
the
que hacen
ecology of
diversos.
ecosystems, and so on and so
Entonces,
forth.
vamos con la primera
So,
sección,
first
uno,
lesson
es responder
to respond
oportunamente a las alertas
timely
sanitarias.
to sanitary or health
¿Por qué?
warnings or alerts.
Porque puede
Why?
pasar lo que aquí
Because
ocurrió y nadie lo vio venir. Los eventos
probably
pueden ser
nobody
terribles,
events could be
pero
much greater than
aquí hubo
expected.
alertas
There were some
antes de la emergencia y
alerts
habían
before the
señales de que íbamos a
emergency. There
tener
were
la posibilidad
signs of what was happening
de
in the
riesgo de
U.S.,
migraciones de
the
aves y
risk
teníamos
of a
capacidad de
bird
migración.
migration. We had the
Los
previous
países
background.
hicieron un esfuerzo
Countries
por
made an
prepararse,
effort in
pero
order
la
to
verdad
become
es que
prepared,
la
but
preparación que hubo en la mayoría de los
preparedness
países,
in
sobre
most
todo los que fueron
countries,
más afectados,
especially those
no
who were most affected,
vieron, como decíamos,
they did not size the magnitude of events. We had concurrent cases in wildlife, backyard, uh, poultry, as we said, concurrent, and also during a long period of time, nearly 2 years. There were 15 countries affected, most of them with wildlife, backyard, only 5 countries with poultry, and there were 5 countries with marine mammals. And we also know these 2 cases in humans. Now, we look at poultry, which could be a lot for some, but there was a great impact in these whole 5 countries. There were 75 uh, outbreaks, over 600 breaks of a backyard farm, 600 outbreaks in the wild bird, so with over 50 species now for poultry outbreaks, and nearly 70% was layers, despite it also affected other systems. Over 6 million birds affected, either dead or cold. But this complexity, this challenges is not just the wildlife, but or backyard, but is the fact that this was concurrent in all 5 countries. There were multiple outbreaks at the same time, which put a pressure on the veterinary services. The second lesson is that early detection and a quick response for wildlife and poultry is the beginning of the success to control the emergency. Early detection is given by meeting a sequence of events in the shortest possible time and then as accurately as possible. Suspect, reporting, reaction to reporting, and confirmation. We found that times overall were adequate, except for some delays, sometimes between suspect and reporting, on or confirmation with the detection of H5. There were some cases when there were many samples, so pressure was put on labs, but the capacity was adequate. We believe it affected, in this reporting area, the fact that they don't have compensation or rewarding systems, except for a few exceptions. Now, there is a particular situation now with wild birds. This is new in the huge amount, especially in the Pacific and the Atlantic countries, where there were lots of reports which had to be served without properly defining cases, little knowledge in sampling, and then for processing of analysis. The carcass culling or culling and carcass disposal should consider the diversity and complexity of productive systems. There were multiple systems, and there were problems in mainly 3 groups. Number one, for layers, especially the battery layers. There were lots of difficulties for culling, cleaning, disinfection. It also had the problems with the case definition. Is one shed, more than one shed. Some sheds did not have clinical symptoms. Not enough people for managing these culling and disposal of carcasses. There was a problem in every country. We took data from WOAH, the WA, and the average was a greater between the onset of the outbreak and the end of the outbreak, even more than a year. This is an indicator. We are assessing an FAO in order to have objective metrics to see the ability to face these outbreaks. The second situation with some backyards, especially in remote areas, difficult to access, or social problems in some communities, where we also had situations which were not able to anticipate. And last but not least, marine mammals, which many times died at the beach, sometimes among people, difficult to access, moving them. So 200, 300 kilogram animals, difficult to bury them. And then we will see the situation of who will take the responsibility. I believe these are the three most challenging situations. Lesson number 4, management of containment area should be predefined for different scenarios and be implemented in a quick manner. Even though every country had these containment area around outbreaks and to manage them, but there was not a good definition of what to do with this, with backyard, commercial, was not always clear what farms should conduct the surveillance, how to start, where to start, what specific actions, how many rounds, how to manage the communities, how to reduce the impact of productive continuity, especially at the onset of outbreaks when everything was frozen, how to release and to allow the movement of birds and eggs. This is very important because it requires a large amount of people to manage containment and think of multiple places, countries did well with one outbreak, but with additional outbreaks, there was a challenge in managing this situation. Lesson number 5, biosafety of flocks is not instant. Emergency should be adjusted to producers and critical aspects. If biosafety was not at the right level before the emergency, it's difficult to build this biosafety during the emergency. This was clear in small producers with biosafety, it's low, and of course, those were greatly affected because of these exposure to wild birds. This is not only true in this area, but also in commercial birds, where even though there was an improvement in biosafety in many producers, some had certain breaks, breaches, and hence infection. Now, one of the things we need to emphasize in biosafety, which some countries noted with the proper focus on biosafety, is that the barrier is not just around the farm, but above all, the sheds, because infection may be within the farm, and therefore you have to protect gates and wire fences in order because of the infection from wild birds. Countries, this is another positive thing. Use this awareness in order to adjust their biosafety programs or to implement the new biosafety programs, which are now being implemented in a mandatory basis. Lesson number 6, vaccination decision and the application strategy should be anticipated based on risk and an economic assessment. We know there are guidelines of vaccination. Many scientists have talked about what are the steps to be followed, but these emergency actually found most countries without even thinking potential scenarios in order to to make the decision to vaccinate. There were lots of concern, producers, pressure, of course, from some laboratories, well, lots of concern among countries, and some had to go through these decision-making process very fast with lots of uncertainty. Some made the decision to vaccinate, others decided not to, and we had 4 countries that went for vaccination: Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Uruguay. In the case of Bolivia and Ecuador, well, in every country, there was sort of voluntary vaccines, except for Uruguay, which was mandatory once. Bolivia and Ecuador are zones where they use vaccination, and Peru is an ongoing national coverage. In this process, which should be noted, countries put this process together. They also face challenges that even today are still challenges. For instance, surveillance with infected populations, how to early define a viral circulation, how to define the closure of the process, and the declaration of free without vaccination. That's four examples we are monitoring to learn some lessons. Lesson 7, risk communications is critical for managing health strategies. Like COVID, this emergency went through the social media. That changes the paradigm as to how the veterinary services, government and private sector have to face an emergency. It could be positive, but also could have a downside. Also, because of the characteristics of the disease, stakeholders not only were producers, but and the rest of the chain, but also citizens, particularly for wild fauna. In the case of Chile and Peru, this was during summer. Beaches were full of people, so rolling out a communication, a risk communication campaign was a big challenge. Also, some countries where veterinary teams doing their job would not be consistent with the technical support from communication teams. There was no consistency. And other countries with a very good consistency, there was a which was a great help in managing this emergency. Lesson 8. Administrative aspects should have high priority and preparation or preparedness to support the emergency management. There's a big consensus here. Every country suffered technical implementation difficulties as a result of excess bureaucracy, challenges to sign contracts for procurement, to hire people, for leasing. I mean, the whole support in order to implement these emergency management, even in critical times, it was a private sector or international agencies or other services have to supply resources, money, people in order to make up for those critical aspects. This is one of the most challenging aspects that increased the risk and affected emergency management campaigns. Last but not least, lesson number 9, efficacy and efficiency of emergencies may be critical with the optimum public-private alliance. In every country in the region, there is a very good relationship between the veterinary services and the avian associations. There was collaboration in the building of awareness, but there was a lot of difference between countries. In some cases, it was reactive, and in others was very proactive. They were part of the design, implementation, and funding of critical aspects of the campaign, epidemiological surveillance, biosafety, and outbreak management. Not only resources, but also for their people in order to speed up the managing of those emergencies. In the public case, to say that there was in many countries, we had this problem with the ministries or those responsible for wildlife and conservation. In most countries, they were not used to face health situations, especially of these size, not adequate or coordination, no people, no resources, and that made managing wildlife challenging. But there was a very good relationship with the ministries of health, which was also actually true before these emergencies. So we could say 3 things which we believe are critical. Number 1, as we have shown, the greatest deficiencies have to do with management, managing measures. Not that the veterinary services did not know what to do. Actually, of course, there were some gaps, some specifics, but problems, challenges, the lessons have to do with how you manage, especially with this level of complexity and magnitude and size, where we have small producers and a wild birds. That's a different challenge, a different way to manage, different costs. So we need a different readiness. Having said that, the other conclusion is that
finalmente igual una respuesta eficaz.
there was an effective response, maybe not as efficient, but it was a very effective. Of all 5 countries that had the cases with the poultry, 3 countries have already recovered their status, free status. With that amount, it was a very successful campaign. Why? Despite not being ready enough, that's because they had a structure and an operation which was very strong, an organization, staff, expertise, which managed to react properly. Leadership in the veterinary services, ministries of agriculture, and of course, a public-private alliance made up for these potential deficiencies or weaknesses, and they were able to face and tackle this emergency. Last but not least, there's a huge lesson here, which are still in the way of processing. These are some of the lessons learned. We're still learning from the process and what is happening even today. It's also from that we can identify possibilities for improvement. Some recommendations. We need to, of course, strengthening the knowledge on disease epidemiology, as shown by Dr. Swan, but not only at the global level, but each country has to learn how the virus is moving. We believe it's circulating in most countries in one way or another. We need to know that. An amazing effort, a huge effort is needed there. Second, we need to build scenarios and very demanding and challenging simulations. Reacting to standard situations is not enough. We need to go a step further. Of course, we need to adjust contingency plans and training as a function of these new scenarios. There again, we need to be we need to require more. And as a specific recommendation, administrative procedures that have to better support emergencies. This is a weakness. This is a huge weakness because sometimes we're lagging behind instead of being ahead of the disease. This is a critical aspect. On biosafety, of course, we cannot, as we said, we cannot improve biosafety in such a short while because of budget issues, cultural issues, operational issues. We need to do that in advance. And then to transfer responsibility to the privates. We believe countries, both associations and producers, may do a lot more than what they do today in readiness and management of emergencies. And of course, these agencies, especially wildlife agencies, should join these One Health approach. And last but not least, we believe we need to emphasize or continue to promote collaboration among countries. We're born witnesses. Countries with more advanced veterinary service could transfer and share that knowledge to other countries with less development. There was lots of collaboration back and forth. So this is a publication. This is a new publication summarizing this period, explaining epidemiology, the measures adopted by countries, and offers some recommendations. That's what I had for you today, and we'll continue to work in order to learn more lessons from this emergency. Thank you very much.
Excelente síntesis de las lecciones aprendidas, muy correlacionado con con la situación epidemiológica que mostró David
Thank you, and
anteriormente.
this is closely linked to what David mentioned beforehand, and of course, based on evidence, I would like to highlight that indeed avian influenza challenges health systems, and this is something that was already mentioned, the need to anticipate this in a coordinated manner between all agencies. In other words, one single health. This possibility of entering into public-private alliances, as from the very beginning, is extremely important before or faced with these emergencies, and in our countries we don't view with absolute clarity, and therefore this idea of facing up to these challenges in our simulations to challenge ourselves much more. The other important point that you highlighted and that we have to underscore is that the vaccine as a tool is not an absolute solution, but involves many aspects that countries have to be aware of. The generation and the strengthening of capacities for avian influenza is a process of continuous improvement, and as you well mentioned, administrative bureaucracy often is incapable of responding with the timeliness that emergencies require, that veterinary services are able to do but are unable to do because of these administrative barriers, and therefore we need to take this into consideration in order to better respond to these needs. Thank you, Hernan, for your presentation. At present, we have around 350 participants from throughout the region. Thank you very much for being connected online. I remind you that you can post your questions in the chat for the presenter of your interest. And I would like to mention that at the end of the session, you'll be able to download your participation certificate, and that this webinar and its contents will be available at the FAO webpage. Finally, we have the presentation by José González. José González will refer to a risk analysis linked to a recommendation that Hernan has just mentioned, and which refers to this analysis in a country context. José is a veterinary doctor. He trained in Bolivia and holds a PhD in epidemiology at the Utrecht University in Holland. He is in charge of the risk analysis group at the bio-veterinary research in Holland. He has worked on this since 2008 and is an acknowledged expert from EXA in this work on avian influenza, and has contributed to the design and evaluation of vaccination strategies for this disease in these when it comes to this poultry. Thank you, José, for being with us. I know that it's very late in the country where you reside, so we truly thank you for being present at this seminar. So you have the floor. Thank you. I'll share my screen with you.
Pantalla.
Perfecto, José.
Can you see my screen? Yes, perfect.
Bueno, pues buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Es un placer estar
Thank you
participar de este seminario.
very much, everyone. It's a great pleasure to participate in this seminar, and I would like to thank the invitation by the FAO. Now, I would like to refer to the way in which we can conduct a risk assessment on avian influenza in order to detect geographic spaces and the adequate time for us to focus our surveillance activities and improve our biosafety. In this risk assessment, I will not be touching upon the issue related to the risk of the introduction of avian influenza in poultry products in commercial terms. Now, when we talk about, well, we have to focus on risk in different populations, so we cannot
la población avícola. Ya David Swain ha dado una presentación
Well,
general de
David
todo lo
Swain
que
has given us
significa para el empresarial actualmente.
a
Y
presentation about
cuando
what avian
empezamos a hablar de lo
influenza
que son
means
riesgos,
today. And when we
empezamos a
begin to talk about
identificar
risks,
factores de
we
riesgos que
begin
son
to
ecológicos, que
identify
están muy ligados a la nutrición,
risk
vamos a
factors that
investigar
are ecological, related
meteorológicos que
to
van a
wild fauna,
microbiológicos,
meteorological factors,
antropogénicos,
microbiological
todos estos van a
factors,
determinar cómo
anthropologic
los procesos de
factors, and
transmisión entre
socioeconomic
distintas poblaciones
factors that
se van a
will
determinar.
that
Y
refers to how
voy a ir dando
transmission
un poco
occurs among the
de a
different
medida que
populations, and I'll give you
empezando esta
examples of that
presentación. Y
during my
lo que voy
presentation.
a hacer ahora es presentar
And what I
en
will do
distintos
now
niveles,
is
que son
to
las
present this at various
poblaciones
levels.
susceptibles de riesgo. La
These
primera
are
es silvestre, porque ahí
susceptible
empieza todo.
populations. First of
Luego
all,
voy a hablar
wild
del lado
birds,
un
because
poco
that is where
de lo que
everything
llamamos riesgos
begins.
de
After that, I'll
poblaciones
talk about
domésticas. Poblaciones
risks to
domésticas,
domestic
voy a
birds.
hablar
I'll
y a enfocar
also
un poco la parte
talk
de mamíferos. Me voy a enfocar
about
en bovinos.
mammals.
Ya
I'll focus
David
on
Swain dio
bovine,
también
on
una
cattle,
una presentación general de lo que son bovinos, y voy a dar un ejemplo de lo que
and
estamos
I'll
haciendo en
also give
Europa
you an
para
example of
tratar
what it is that we're doing in Europe
identificar el riesgo
to
de
try to
introducción
identify the risk of
en poblaciones
introduction
bovinas en ruminantes.
of this
Tenemos
in
a Swain hace unas
bovine
semanas que
and
dio
ruminants, and also the risk on human populations,
en
but I
esta
will not be
presentación.
dealing with that
Bueno,
in
y
this
empezamos con lo que son las
presentation.
aves
Let us
silvestres.
begin with wild birds.
Y bueno, y cuando hablamos de aves
When we
silvestres, lo
talk
que
about
tenemos que
wild
entender,
birds, what we have to
esto
understand,
cuando hablamos de lo que es el riesgo,
and
lo
when we
primero
talk
que hay que
about
ver
the
es su
risk, the
distribución
first thing that
geográfica.
we have to focus
El
on
número de
is
especies que
on
tenemos
their
en la región,
geographic distribution, the number of
cuántas
species
son,
in
cómo
the
están
region,
afectadas, cómo están
how,
distribuidas, la
how they
densidad
are distributed,
de estas
the
poblaciones
density of this
silvestres
population, of
migratorias y
this wild
susceptibles,
migratory
su distribución
population,
temporal, porque hemos
their
visto que hay una
distribution over time,
estacionalidad en
because we have seen that there is a certain
lo que
level of
es las poblaciones
seasonality when it comes
migratorias
to,
principalmente,
especially
y también
to
los cambios de
migratory
variación.
birds, and also
Les
viral
menciono un
changes.
ejemplo,
And David mentioned a whole
genotipos, y voy
series of
mencionando distintos
genotypes, and
genotipos.
he mentioned
Esto influye
various
también
genotypes, because,
cuál es
and
la
this obviously
diferencia
has an influence
de
upon the
epidemiológico.
virulence,
Tenemos
the
determinadas especies
severity that
silvestres y
that
también
this
la
how this
distribución
impacts
económica
various
también por especies. Ahora voy
wild
a empezar a
species, and how
explicar.
it impacts other species, including domestic
Ahora,
birds.
lo que les voy a ir
Now,
mostrando es
what
algo que
I will
estamos
show
haciendo
you is
en
something that we're
Holanda, en
doing in
en Holanda,
our
lo que
team
estamos
in
desarrollando es un
Holland.
modelo
What we're
simple.
developing is a
Disculpen
very
por
simple
estas
model.
ecuaciones acá, pero en
Please
realidad es
forgive me for
un
all these
modelo
equations,
simple
but
donde
basically
estamos
it's a
tratando un
simple
poco de
model
tratar
where
de
we
identificar
distance ourselves
dónde
from
tenemos
trying to
brotes.
identify
Más
where it is
estamos
that we find
viendo
outbreaks. So we
utilizar
are
conocimiento de
rather
lo que son
focusing
factores
on
de
using
riesgo
knowledge
y
about
combinar esto
risk factors and combining that with
datos generales de la
the
población. Por ejemplo,
the
la densidad
general
de bovinos
data
que
of the
tenemos.
population.
Voy a hablar más adelante
For
de dar
example,
el
the
ejemplo
density of bovines that we
que tenemos
have,
en la FAO,
and
los
I'll
datos de la
talk
FAO. Voy a hablar sobre las
about this later
poblaciones
on,
de
involving FAO
aves
data or the
silvestres. Ahora voy
case
a
of
presentar lo que es este portal
wild
de
bird
eBird,
populations. Here we can
donde se
enter
tienen
this
muchos reportes
portal
de lo que
called
son
eBird, where we can obtain many
densidades
reports
relativas
on
de aves
the
silvestres
relative
de
density
diversas
of
especies. Y
wild
eso nos
birds
permite
and
utilizar estos
involving many
datos,
species.
estar
And this enables us to
disponibles
use this
al acceso de
available
los
data
funcionarios
available in
para
various
empezar a hacer nuestro análisis. Dígame, todo
databases in order to
combinado con nuestro
conduct our
conocimiento de lo que
analysis
es
combined
lo que es
with
el riesgo.
our knowledge when it comes
Un
to
ejemplo
risk
es, por ejemplo, cuando
factors.
estamos viendo el
For
riesgo, que son las
example, when we look
poblaciones
at
silvestres,
the
aquí
risk
el ejemplo
with
de los chararidae, que son
wild
pájaros que han
populations, these
desaparecido, que serían
are
los
ducks
chararidae, que serían por ejemplo, las gaviotas.
and also
Si nos enfocamos
seagulls
entonces
up here.
en estos,
If we
en estos
focus
dos
on
zonas, tenemos a
the
los pájaros, por
risk
ejemplo,
and we look at
factores
ducks,
que
for
determinan el
example,
riesgo de influenza. Los
risk
primeros que nos van a
factors
intervenir van a ser
for
sus
influenza
hábitos alimenticios.
will be their
Tenemos
feeding
especies de
habits.
ratos que
We
serían
have duck
patos
species
de superficie
which are
que
called
comen en la
surface
superficie del agua cuando están
ducks
nadando.
that eat on
Tenemos
the
los patos
surface
que
of the
se mueven,
water.
que van
We
a
also
nadar,
have
buscan su comida.
the
Tenemos,
ducks
por
that
ejemplo,
dive
incluso los
down
gansos
to find
los árabes,
their
que
food, and we
gustan
have
mucho
other
comer en el
species
pasto.
that
Estos hábitos
um,
alimenticios
have
determinan el
different feeding
riesgo
habits, and this determines
de contraer el
the
influenza aviar. Ya
risk
tenemos nuestro aviar.
of
Aquí solamente vamos a darle el ejemplo de
having avian
riesgos
influenza.
relativos que nos ayudan a determinar ese nivel
And
de
this
riesgo que tiene.
enables us
Eso
to
podemos
determine
combinarlo también con
the level
factores
of
de
risk, and we
riesgo
can
que
combine that
contribuyen
with
a la presencia del
risk
virus
factors that
o a la
contribute to the presence
supervivencia
of the
del
virus or
del
to
clima.
the survival of
Si
the
es un
virus. For
periodo de
example,
invierno, si
climate.
hace frío,
If it's
entonces
wintertime, if it's
disminuimos, por
cold,
ejemplo,
the virus can
y
survive
por
for a
ejemplo, en la
longer
época del
period
verano
of time
la
compared compared to summer seasons. Now, we can obtain all this data from internet, and this combination enables us to determine the risk. And in this sense, we can we see here a risk map combining all the different risk factors and the distribution of wild birds.
Es de acceso gratuito. Y ahí pueden
And
tenerlo
this is
todo lo
taken
que
from
relaciona con
eBird, that is freely accessible, and you can find the risk factors here for Europe.
También lo armamos
Likewise, we created this for the region, for the Americas, and what you can see here is not that in South America there is a low risk. It simply means that we have no data for this. I know that there is data, because I have heard presentations where they have mapped this adequately, the density of wild birds and the species that they have, but I couldn't gain access to that and I couldn't find them. And therefore, we can see that we have good data for North America, for the US and Canada, and that enables us to map this risk using the risk factors that I mentioned, and the expert knowledge and the data that we obtain about density and species. Now, I would like to explain how it is that we apply this to domestic birds. And when we're talking about the risk, we're talking about the space and time risk, very closely linked to the distribution of wild birds, to the abundance of migratory wild birds, the type of production, and this was shown by Hernan, biosafety, and also vaccination. I'm not going to be dwelling on the issue of vaccination today. Now, when we try to identify risks only based on knowledge and risk factors and population data, we begin with the geographic distribution, the seasonal distribution of wild birds. After that, we also consider the population distribution and the type of production of domestic birds. And they also have their own specific risk, and everything that exists in this interface that will contribute to contact between wild birds and poultry. There are risk factors that will facilitate this interface. And I'll explain some of them. Looking at domestic birds, so the type of production is a risk factor. And you must be aware that these are this involves the risk of introduction from wild birds. And if we use as a reference commercial poultry establishments and reproducers for the European case, we find that when it comes to that the risk is significantly 5 times less, and that occurs in South America because Elan showed that it was there precisely where we found the largest number of outbreaks. In the case of Turkey, this is significantly higher. Now, when we look at the risk of the interface, what factors contribute to this connection between wild birds and commercial birds or commercial production establishments? First of all, the use of land. In Holland, when we're close to the pen, the pasture area, and the distance from the pen to water bodies and to the size of the water body, that increases the risk. And that is logical because if there is grass there, there will be geese and ducks, geese there, and if there's water, there will be ducks there, and that will be very close to the sheds, and therefore there is a risk of introduction there. If there is also a lot of many trees around the sheds, this reduces the risk. It contributes to protection. Whenever there's trees surrounding these sheds, the risk of infection is smaller. These are all factors that will contribute to a higher or lower risk of introduction. And when we combine these risks during the interface, the presence of wild birds and the risks related to the type of production, the Let's see, the data that we have obtained have to do with the population and density of ducks and of backyard birds. The FAO has that data so that all countries can use them. And when we combine that with the risk factors, well, that enables us to produce a map. And what I'm showing you is a risk map that we produce with this simple model. And I call it a simple model because this is available, involves available data plus our knowledge of risk factors, that combination that I showed you. And this is an advanced model using machine learning and all incorporating the different outbreaks that we had in farms. We used machine learning and we created this map. This is a more advanced process, and this is using the model that I explained, which is using the data that is available. And we were quite happy with these results following the validation of this process. And now with regards to biosafety, something that Enan already referred to. I'm not going to explain this in detail, but what I would like to show you here, these are farms that experienced outbreaks in Holland. And what we did was to place cameras in this intermediate zone, in the clean zone. We placed cameras and we monitored the sheds. We monitored them for approximately 3 months. And what we have here is that these is reproducers. These are egg layers. These are using poultry for eggs and for meat production. And this is 25%, but basically it's a proportion of time said that the shed manager, and this is in a went to the area where the birds were without changing their boots, because one of the biosafety measures is to change your boots. And in this case, in more than 10% of our observations, that person walked right up to the birds without changing their boots. We found that every time they violated a biosafety measure, that was they didn't violate them in the morning, but in the afternoon when they were much more tired. And therefore, what our idea was to capture all the probabilities. For example, not changing boots. But basically what we saw at the end of the day is that every day at least one of the biosafety regulations were violated. The worst one is, of course, not changing their boots. And if you have a lot of ducks, when you have a lot of wild birds, there is a lot of feces of wild birds. And if you step on that, well, you simply transfer those feces to the following area, and that leads to an outbreak. These are the risks in bovine, in cattle. This was explained in sheep in Europe and so on. This has already been explained, but this is basically not a specificity in terms of the different types of what is present in the US. At an experimental level, we have found that the viruses in Europe can also circulate elsewhere without much a problem. And in the case of non-bovines, these are the different risks that can be found in the transmission from wild birds to bovines. And we can also have this process here. I will focus on giving an example of this work where we are trying to assess how we measure the risk of introduction of this in bovines as from wild populations. And this has to do with the density and circulation of wild birds, and also the density of bovines, the size of dairy farms, basically. What we have done, and this is work which is presently being evaluated, our idea was to assess the risk of introducing wild birds to bovines in Europe, and we obtained data from Avian, as I said, density, bovine density data from the FAO, and in the case of And for Europe, we have the bird flu radar, which involves the various regions or quadrants in Europe on a time basis where we find that risk. And we use this data, first of all, to estimate the probability of spillover of the introduction of wild birds from wild birds to bovines. And in the US, we found about 3 independent introductions, which were here in Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. And after that, we used this combination, and we tried to estimate that the risk in Europe, and in this case, the case of Denmark. And this is what we can create. This is a risk map of Denmark. These are weeks of the year, and it evidences where there is a higher risk of an introduction from wild birds to bovines. In which weeks this involves a greater risk, and when the risk is smaller, and we haven't yet adjusted in terms of production, because FAO data talks about bovines generally. It doesn't separate between the milk producers or meat producers and the type of pens that are used in Northern Europe. The cows, the animal is kept indoors, basically. Unlike what happens in Texas, for example, because in Texas, even during the winter, they are kept in open areas. What I would like to mention is that the problem of avian influenza is a health problem. It impacts many populations, and epidemiologists, ecologists, virologists, data managers, health managers are all working on that. This involves multidisciplinary work, because it is a multidisciplinary problem and it has to be dealt with in that same fashion. We must understand the risk factors in the different populations that are susceptible, and we must also improve. We need to understand epidemiology when it comes to wild birds, and improve our surveillance of wild birds. And only then, if we strengthen that, we will be better understand the epidemiology and be better prepared for this. And in the case of biosafety, what we say in Holland is that it's okay for us to conduct biosafety assessments. We conduct audits and we have a questionnaire, and those are all perfect. But if we put a camera in place, we'll find violations of all biosafety measures, and we must comply with these measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for your time, for your presentation of this risk analysis. This is the end of the presentation. Now we'll have a round of Q and question and answers. But let me summarize a couple of ideas from your presentation, which I believe are good. Could you emphasize the need of data? This is something we have to know. This map of the Americas, where there are no public data for risk analysis, that's a vulnerability which we will have to work on. The other point, which is very important, is biosafety. But biosafety from the point of view of changing behaviors. It's not just regulation, standardization of procedures, but compliance and provide for continuity, consistency in the implementation of biosafety will protect us individually, but as well as individually in terms of the possibility of decreasing spreading of the disease. We are about to exhaust our hour and a half, but we have a couple of minutes for closing questions in the chat pod. Remember, you will be able to download the certificate, and then this webinar and the contents will be made available through FAO's webpage. First question here, it's for David, as to this complex epidemiology of this virus. You've shown that there has been some sort of a change in the behavior from wildlife towards not just the wildlife, but the other species and among productive systems because of an anthropological issue, a lack of care. What's your outlook in terms of the evolution of the virus, this need of action among countries?
So I think some of this has been also touched on by Jose and Hernan, is that surveillance is a really key and critical issue to kind of understand what the risk is. And I think for us, the biggest change in agriculture has been the establishment of this virus lineage in a variety of different bird species, especially migratory aquatic birds, being waterfowl and shorebirds. And because of that, I think we will continue to see these spillover events, most frequently being backyard poultry because of direct exposure. But also we're going to see it in commercial poultry. And as has already been mentioned by Jose, is that the risk is different for different species. For example, domestic ducks and turkeys are higher risk than chickens, and that we need to practice better biosecurity to reduce those problems. The second thing is we will continue to see spillover into, I'll say, aberrant host, and that's species that are not normally infected with avian influenza viruses. We've had it in dairy cattle in the U.S., and it has become established, and now we're in the process of eradicating it from dairy cattle. But we've also seen these spillover events in the UK in sheep, in the US in goats, and a few pigs. And so I think surveillance is the issue that we all need to focus on within the Americas, to do surveillance in a statistical way across all of our agricultural species to make sure we don't have an unexpected introduction that we don't act upon immediately. And that would hopefully prevent it from becoming established. Thank you.
Gracias, David. Muy claro. Tenemos una pregunta.
Thank you, David. We have a question from Brigadier Amador. I believe it was partially answered by David with this of whether we wait for the possibility of mammal to mammal. That is a dynamic. This is dynamic virus, so we need to reinforce this message of improving surveillance systems and to monitor. Do monitoring of how the virus moves. We need to insist, emphasize the need of having data available. Now, we have a question for Jose. It is clear that data helps us in the risk analysis, but when we have a limiting access to data, so the question is, how do we run risk analysis without data? I mean, how would you address that? This is a progressive, a gradual approach. Collecting data takes time. What's the approach to these risk analysis with a qualitative analysis? One of the efforts of this model I've just shown, which is based on knowledge and access to data already available in the networks, it's trying to addressing this constraint, this limitation. Just that for wild birds, we don't have data available in Latin America, for Latin America, or at least it's not being reported. Every other data may be obtained from FAO, temperature, climate, land use, all those is available. The part of wildlife, that it's a different thing. But some countries do have this data, or at least in collaboration with local universities, ornithologists, biologists, we can collect this data. Although not perfect, but this is combination of knowledge, expertise, which are taken into risk factors, and how you combine that with available data. I believe there are some data available, and what I've shown, it's 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 semi-quantitative. Using data, we're adding using different weights for risk factors, which is expert knowledge or literature, and based on that, we started this mapping approach. Thank you, Jose. Great. Now, Hernan, lessons learned. They've been clear. We need to continue to emphasize strengthening of systems, building of capabilities in the veterinary services to anticipate, reinforce biosafety. It is clear that we need a high level of readiness and coordination. If I were to ask, what's the effective way to continue to work as a country, what would you say about that?
Bueno, gracias, Nicolás.
Thank you,
Bueno, parte de eso
Nicholas.
está justamente en las recomendaciones
Well, that's
y
part of the recommendations, and I will concur that we'll need a much greater effort.
es seguir profundizando, y me voy a colgar de la
Let me
presentación
go back to Jose's presentation. Countries
avanzar en conocer más de
need to
epidemiología,
learn more about the epidemiology of the disease in countries through surveillance, research. Besides, congratulations, Jose, for this simple model for his approach, so that the actions should always be based on risk. Resources are limited, so we cannot do the same thing everywhere. We need to go find the disease. We need to identify the spreading paths so as not to spend resources, not to overspend limited resources. That's effort number one, to continue to move forward in learning the epidemiology of the disease and to produce risk assessments. Second, readiness, preparedness, that it has to be progressive. FAO and everyone has said that the readiness is a great investment, so it's not to improvise in case of an emergency. But that it's challenging, it's difficult, and with an economic assessment. This is an FAO, we're working on that. We have early economic assessments to identify the most cost-effective models. Everything we do costs money. Money will allow this for good management. So this relationship, epidemiology, risk, and the economic valuing in advance, it's very important. And the third leg is that we have to break away with the paradigm that the states or the veterinary services have to are responsible for this. But we need engagement and participation of the private sector, not just the private sector offering the resources, but we have to be very intelligent as to how knowledge is used, the ability of the private sector to contribute to a public good. And last but not least, the One Health approach. The challenge here, it's far beyond the veterinary service, just the view of poultry. So we have a challenge here in terms of the approach we have to these multiple dimensions of both assessment as well as risk management. Thank you, Hernan. We only have time for one more question. So Karin Franco from Compliance Vet in Brazil, she's asking about the vaccination, Hernan. Vaccination leads to lots of questions, but the number one question here, what was the process for validating those countries using that regionally, and what's the costing efficiency and opportunity? Was that part of the process? Let me answer just part of the question. because we do not have all the information as to how processes took place. We were just outside support. But what we found, like I said in the presentation, veterinary services, all four applying vaccine. First, they follow the guidelines of the WOA. They made an effort to learn the virus which was circulating, the characteristics of the virus. Third, they received the different laboratories to properly select the best vaccine for their own situation. They got experts, international experts on board. Jose was a great collaborator here, offering his guidelines so that countries could make the best decision given their particular situations. Also, they had to address lots of pressures, desperate pressure from the private sector, or for pressure to use the vaccine. There was lots of uncertainty in this epidemic curve, especially back in 2023. I mean, you have to position yourself back then, and I would say a decision was made. As you saw, countries were very conservative. They focused on certain risk areas. Others was countrywide, given the situation they were going through. This was they conducted a risk assessment using the elements they had at hand. They all built their protocols, regulations. They all have the rules and national rules and regulations. Every country, unlike you, except for Uruguay, there were voluntary processes focused on breeders and layers, except for Peru, which was open to growers and fighting roosters. No country authorized backyard vaccination, which was a good decision back then. And then they were technically and operationally forced to identify the infections, surveillance. And if you remember, back then, everyone was waiting for the guidelines from the EPSA panel, which offered great guidelines as to how to do the surveillance. Not much knowledge was available back then in all four countries. They also had a decrease in the viral activity. No outbreaks have taken place in vaccinated populations, at least with the characteristics we had back then. And here I close. There's still a challenge, and as FAO, we will face that, which is we need to go deeper into the lessons learned from that vaccination process. That's important for the region, for the world. There is not vast experience in vaccination processes in this step, and this is for the benefit of the whole world. Thank you, Hernan. We're actually 15 minutes late. Let me adjourn the session. It's nearly 430 people from the whole region. Thank you for being there. Final conclusion. I mean, the message is continue to keep in touch, pay attention to avian flu. It's a epidemiological reality in the whole continent. One Health calls for these coordination. So there are some actions and possibilities to engage and address the avian flu. We need to reinforce the importance of risk communications. This is an ongoing work, and not only in regulations, but the implementation of response measures, biosafety, with a consistent approach. And there's improvement, there's an ongoing improvement of practice, the challenge of reaching the backyard, and the message of the need to integrate data. These data are available in the whole throughout the whole system in our countries. That probably we don't have the right tool to collect this data, and this is necessary because it will facilitate risk management. For that, we need to strengthen this message of integrated work through alliances. We're all part, and alliances, public-private alliances are mechanisms to improve the response under One Health. FAO will continue to update this information. We'll continue to share information at the regional level. This solidarity, that's part of our mandate, has to do with the availability, with having the information available so that everyone can act in the best possible way in your country. So we will be sending additional invitations to webinars. You will have access to contents and FAO publications, which are available as a resource for all those who may need them. And of course, we'd like to thank all four speakers today, offering their time to this knowledge transfer for the whole region. So thank you for that, and thank you everyone for joining, and good afternoon from FAO. Thank you.